The whispers of Silver Peak had long forgotten the sound of Hannah Morgan's laughter. 8 years she'd weathered alone on the edge of the Colorado frontier, her solitude a shield against memories that cut deeper than the winter winds. But fate had other plans on this stormy April night in 1875, when a thunderous knock shattered the quiet sanctuary she'd built for herself. Hannah reached for the shotgun, propped beside the door, her calloused fingers wrapping around the familiar wooden stock. The plains of Colorado had taught her caution, especially when living 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. Silver Peak might be growing since the new silver mine opened 2 years back, but out here, a woman alone was still her own first and last line of defense. The pounding came again, more desperate this time, accompanied by a man's deep voice that somehow cut through the howl of the storm. "Please, madam, anyone there? We need shelter." When Hannah cracked open the door, shotgun raised, the sight before her nearly made her step back. Illuminated by a flash of lightning stood the largest man she'd ever seen, 6.5 feet tall at least, broad-shouldered, with rain-soaked clothes clinging to a frame that seemed carved from the mountains themselves. But what caught her attention wasn't his imposing presence. It was the tiny bundle clutched protectively against his chest, a small whimpering sound emerging from beneath the drenched blanket. "Please," the stranger said again, his voice breaking as he shifted the bundle. The movement revealed a baby's face, red and scrunched with discomfort. "Just one night. My little girl's burning up with fever. We've been caught in this storm for hours." His eyes, a startling clear blue, held no threat, only desperation and exhaustion. Hannah's finger eased off the trigger. "Who are you?" "Hank Jameson, madam, from up Montana way." He adjusted his stance, shielding the infant from the driving rain. "I wouldn't ask, but there's nowhere else for miles. The town's too far in this weather, and she's—" His voice caught. "She needs to be warm and dry." The baby's weak cry made Hannah's decision for her. 8 years of solitude had hardened her resolve, but not her heart. She stepped back, lowering the shotgun. "Come in then, but just for tonight." As Hank ducked through the doorway, Hannah Morgan couldn't know that this one night would unravel the careful isolation she'd built around herself, since the day she buried her husband and son beneath the unforgiving Colorado soil. Hannah's cabin was modest but meticulously maintained, a testament to her self-reliance. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light across the polished wooden floors she'd installed herself. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting area combined, with a small bedroom partitioned off in the back. Every inch spoke of careful attention, from the tightly chinked logs to the neat row of preserved fruits lining a shelf. "Set her down here," Hannah instructed, clearing space on a rocking chair near the fire and laying out a clean blanket. "I'll fetch some fresh water." Hank moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man, cradling the infant as if she were made of glass. As he unwrapped the damp blanket, Hannah caught her first clear glimpse of the child, no more than 6 months old, with wisps of dark hair plastered to a feverish forehead. "What's her name?" Hannah asked, returning with a basin of water and clean rags. "Lily," Hank answered softly, his rough hands looking enormous as they carefully held the tiny form. "After her mother." Hannah nodded, not asking the obvious question about where the mother was. She'd heard enough stories of women lost in childbirth to recognize the grief etched into the lines of this man's weathered face. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, soaking a cloth and gently bathing the baby's flushed skin. "When did the fever start?" she asked, keeping her voice professional, detached. "Yesterday morning. We were passing through these parts, heading south. Thought we could make it to Silver Peak before the storm." He ran a hand through his sodden dark hair, spattering droplets on the floor. "I'm sorry about the mess, madam." "Hannah," she corrected automatically. "Hannah Morgan, and don't worry about the floor, it's seen worse." Working methodically, Hannah checked the baby for signs of serious illness, relieved to find only the fever and some congestion. "She needs willow bark tea, watered down for an infant. I have some dried herbs that should help." She glanced up at Hank, noting his dripping clothes. "You should change too. I can't have two patients on my hands. There are some clothes in that trunk that might fit you, my husband's." If Hank noticed the slight catch in her voice at the mention of her husband, he didn't comment. He simply nodded his thanks. "I won't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary, Miss Morgan." "Mrs." she corrected, though she hadn't used the title in years. "And I meant what I said just for tonight. First light, you and Lily should be on your way." An hour later, Hank sat beside the fire in clothes that strained at his broad shoulders but were at least dry. Lily, swaddled in fresh linens, had taken a few spoonfuls of the willow bark concoction and now slept more peacefully in a makeshift cradle Hannah had fashioned from a drawer. "You're good with children," Hank observed quietly, watching as Hannah checked Lily's temperature with the back of her hand. Something flickered across Hannah's face, pain, perhaps, or memory before she composed herself. "I had some experience once." The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the cabin roof. Hannah busied herself with preparing a simple meal, cornbread and a rabbit stew that had been simmering all day. "I hope you don't mind sharing," she said, setting a bowl before her unexpected guest. "I don't usually cook for company." Hank accepted the food gratefully. "I can't remember the last proper meal I had. Thank you." As they ate, Hannah studied her visitor more carefully. Despite his intimidating size, there was nothing threatening in his manner. His face, now visible without the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, was handsome in a rugged way tanned from outdoor life, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. A scar ran along his right temple, disappearing into his hairline. But it was his eyes that caught her attention again, clear blue, honest, and carrying a sadness that matched her own. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Jameson?" Hannah asked, breaking the silence. "Just Hank," he replied, setting down his spoon. "I'm looking for work. Heard the silver mine in Silver Peak was hiring. I was a foreman up in Montana before." He glanced toward the sleeping infant. "Before things changed." Hannah nodded, understanding the unspoken. Life had a way of appending the most solid of plans. "Silver Peak's grown since they struck that vein 2 years back. You shouldn't have trouble finding work if you know mining." "I do. Started when I was 16. He hesitated, then added, "May I ask how long you've been out here alone, Mrs. Morgan?" Hannah stiffened slightly. 8 years. "And I manage just fine." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise," Hank said quickly. "It's just impressive. Most folks I know couldn't handle this kind of isolation." "Most folks haven't had reason to seek it out," Hannah replied, more sharply than she intended. An awkward silence fell between them. Hannah stood to clear the dishes, uncomfortable with how easily this stranger had pushed past her carefully constructed walls with a simple observation. For 8 years, she'd spoken more to her livestock than to other humans, limiting her interactions to brief transactions in town every few months. Now, in the space of an evening, she'd allowed not only a stranger but an infant into her home. As if sensing her discomfort, Hank changed the subject. "That's fine craftsmanship," he said, nodding toward a small wooden horse displayed on the mantel. "Your husband's work." Hannah's hand paused mid-reach for his empty bowl. "Mine, actually." Surprise registered on Hank's face. "You're a carpenter." "I'm a woman who learned to use tools," she corrected. Out here, you either learn or you perish. The storm intensified as the evening wore on, wind howling around the cabin's corners and rattling the shutters Hannah had installed years ago. Lily woke crying once, but settled quickly after another dose of the willow bark tea and the gentle rocking of Hannah's arms. The easy way the baby relaxed against her chest stirred long-buried memories, the weight of another child, the trust of small fingers curled around her own. When Lily was settled again, Hannah turned to find Hank watching her with an unreadable expression. "You should get some sleep," she told him, avoiding his gaze. "You can take the bed. I'll stay out here with Lily." "I couldn't put you out of your bed, Mrs. Morgan. It's no trouble. I often sleep by the fire in winter anyway." It wasn't entirely true, but Hannah felt an inexplicable need to maintain some distance from this man who observed too much. Hank looked like he might argue but seemed to think better of it. "If you're sure." "I am." Hannah settled into the rocking chair, pulling a quilt around her shoulders. "First light, Mr. Jameson. Then you and Lily continue on." Hank nodded slowly. "First light," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he had more to say. Instead, he retreated to the small bedroom, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. Left alone with the sleeping infant, Hannah allowed herself a moment of weakness, gently tracing a finger along Lily's soft cheek. 8 years since she'd touched a child. 8 years since she'd buried her son, just 3 years old, alongside her husband after the influenza swept through their homestead like wildfire, leaving her the sole survivor. Just one night, Hannah whispered to herself, as much a warning as a promise. One night of broken solitude wouldn't undo 8 years of careful isolation. Come morning, the cowboy and his motherless daughter would ride out of her life, and she would return to the safety of her solitude. But as the storm raged outside and the child slept peacefully within arm's reach, Hannah Morgan felt something shift inside her, like the first crack in a dam that had held too long against rising waters. Morning came with the storm's retreat, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming under a pale spring sun. Hannah woke with a start, momentarily confused by the weight in her arms, until she remembered the events of the previous night. Lily was still asleep, her fever noticeably reduced, cheeks no longer flushed with unhealthy color. The sound of chopping wood drew Hannah's attention. Through the window, she saw Hank's broad back as he split logs with her axe, each swing powerful and precise. He'd already amassed a respectable pile beside the chopping block. Hannah felt a strange mixture of irritation and gratitude at the sight. She hadn't asked for his help, yet there was something considerate in the gesture. She gently placed Lily in her makeshift cradle and stepped outside. "You didn't need to do that," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Hank turned, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "Seemed only fair for the hospitality." He set another log on the block. "How's Lily?" "Better. The fever's broken." Hannah hesitated. "You both can stay for breakfast before you head into town." Hank nodded his thanks, bringing down the axe in another clean split. Hannah watched him work for a moment longer than necessary, before returning inside to stoke the fire and prepare a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of her honey. When Hank finally came in, arms loaded with wood, Lily was awake and fussing softly. Hannah had changed her and was attempting to feed her some watered-down goat's milk. "She's never taken well to anything but her mother's milk," Hank explained, setting down the wood and crossing to take his daughter. "We've been making do with goat's milk, but it's been a struggle." "She needs a wet nurse," Hannah observed practically. "I know." Hank's expression clouded. "In Silver Peak, perhaps I can find someone willing." Hannah bit back a comment about the likelihood of finding such accommodations in a mining town. Instead, She focused on serving breakfast, setting a steaming bowl before Hank when he had settled Lily. They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness of the previous night somehow diminished in the clear light of morning. Outside, Hannah's chickens clucked and her goat bleated, reminding her of chores awaiting attention. "I should tend to my animals," she said, rising. "I can help," Hank offered. When Hannah looked skeptical, he added, "I grew up on a ranch. I know my way around livestock." Against her better judgment, Hannah found herself accepting his assistance. Together, they fed the chickens, milked the goat, and checked on Hannah's 2 horses in the small corral behind the cabin. Lily accompanied them, securely bundled and resting in the crook of Hank's arm. Working alongside someone after so many years alone felt strange to Hannah, both intrusive and oddly comforting. Hank moved with the quiet competence of a man accustomed to physical labor, requiring little direction and offering assistance without overstepping. "Your place is well maintained," he commented as they finished the morning chores. "Better than most homesteads I've seen with 2 people working them." Hannah felt an unexpected flush of pride at his words. "I've had time to get it right." Hank's gaze traveled over the neat garden beds, freshly turned for spring planting, the solid-looking barn, and the cabin with its even rows of chinked logs. "Still, it's impressive. You must work from sunup to sundown." "Work keeps the mind occupied," Hannah replied, then immediately regretted the admission. It revealed too much that she needed occupation, distraction from thoughts better left undisturbed. If Hank noticed the implication, he didn't press. Instead, he shifted Lily to his other arm and said, "I should be getting her to town, find that wet nurse and see about work." Hannah nodded, relief and something like disappointment mingling uncomfortably in her chest. "Of course, your horse is rested." As Hank prepared to leave, gathering the few belongings he'd brought in from his saddlebags, Hannah found herself lingering nearby, watching as he carefully wrapped Lily in fresh blankets. The baby seemed vastly improved from the previous night, her eyes bright as she gurgled up at her father. "Thank you, Mrs. Morgan," Hank said formally as he stood ready to depart. "Your kindness won't be forgotten." "It was nothing," Hannah replied, the standard response falling easily from her lips. "Anyone would have done the same." Hank's gaze held hers. "No, they wouldn't. Not everyone would open their door to strangers in a storm." Hannah looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude in his eyes. "Safe travels to Silver Peak, Mr. Jameson." She stood in the doorway, watching as Hank mounted his horse, Lily secured against his chest in a sling he'd fashioned from one of Hannah's donated cloths. He tipped his hat in farewell, and Hannah raised a hand in response, expecting the familiar sense of relief that always came when visitors rare as they were departed. Instead, she felt oddly hollow as she watched horse and riders disappear down the trail toward town. With a shake of her head, Hannah turned back to her empty cabin and the comforting routine of her solitary life. By midday, she told herself, she'd have forgotten all about the cowboy and his motherless child. But as Hannah moved through her day, she found her thoughts returning to them with frustrating regularity. Had they found suitable lodging in Silver Peak? Had Hank secured employment at the mine? Most persistently, had he found someone to properly care for Lily? "This is ridiculous," Hannah muttered to herself as evening approached, and she realized she'd been unconsciously listening for hoofbeats that wouldn't come. One night of disrupted solitude shouldn't have affected her so. Yet as she prepared her usual solitary supper, Hannah found herself glancing repeatedly at the rocking chair where she'd held Lily, and at the place at her table where Hank had sat. The silence, once comforting, now seemed to press in around her with unwelcome weight. She ate without tasting her food, then cleaned up mechanically before settling with her mending beside the fire. Outside, clouds gathered again, promising another spring storm. Hannah tried to focus on her needlework, but her concentration kept slipping. Finally, she set aside her mending with an exasperated sigh. "They're fine," she told the empty room. "They're in town with proper shelter and people who can help them." But even as she spoke the words, Hannah found herself remembering the exhaustion in Hank's eyes, the protective way he'd held his daughter. Silver Peak was no place for a man alone with an infant. The town catered to miners and the businesses that served them: saloons, a general store, a few boarding houses known more for their rowdy guests than comfortable accommodations. There were families there, certainly, but they kept to themselves, wary of the transient population that flowed through with the fortunes of the mine. "It's not your concern," Hannah told herself firmly, rising to prepare for bed. She had spent 8 years cultivating independence and isolation. She wouldn't throw that away over one night of disrupted routine and misplaced concern for strangers. Yet as the rain began to fall once more, pattering against her roof and windows, Hannah found sleep elusive. Her thoughts kept returning to Lily's small face, to the gentle way Hank had tended to his daughter despite his imposing size and obvious exhaustion. 3 days passed, and Hannah settled back into her routine, though not without occasional, unwelcome thoughts of her brief visitors. On the morning of the 4th day, she hitched her wagon for her monthly trip into Silver Peak for supplies. It was pure coincidence, she told herself firmly, that she was making the journey a week earlier than usual. The road into town was rutted from the recent rains but passable. Hannah guided her team with practiced ease, her thoughts stubbornly refusing to anticipate whether she might encounter Hank and Lily. Silver Peak had grown substantially with the mine's success, expanding from the handful of buildings she'd first known to a proper town with several streets branching off the main thoroughfare. The chances of crossing paths were slim. Hannah parked her wagon in front of McCready's general store, securing the horses before stepping down. As always, she felt a prickle of discomfort at the stares her arrival attracted. A woman alone was still something of an oddity, even in a frontier town like Silver Peak. Inside the store, Hannah handed her list to Mr. McCready, a balding man with spectacles who'd been running the establishment since before Hannah arrived in the area. "Mrs. Morgan," he greeted her with a nod. "Earlier than usual this month." "Spring planting," Hannah replied shortly, discouraging further conversation. As McCready gathered her supplies, Hannah browsed the shelves, considering whether to indulge in the small luxury of store-bought coffee beans. Her attention was caught by a conversation between 2 women at the fabric counter. "Poor man doesn't know what he's doing," one was saying. "A baby that's small needs a woman's care, not to be dragged around by a father who works all day." "The widow Simmons is watching her while he's at the mine," the other woman replied, "but she says the child cries all night, keeps the whole boarding house awake." Hannah froze, her hand halfway to a bolt of calico. They could only be talking about Hank and Lily. "Where are they staying?" she asked before she could stop herself. The women turned, surprised by her interruption. Hannah rarely engaged in town gossip or any conversation at all, for that matter. "The new miner with the baby?" the first woman asked, her curiosity evident. "They're at Simmons' boarding house, though word is she's about to turn them out if the baby doesn't quiet down." Hannah nodded her thanks and returned to the counter where McCready had assembled her supplies. "Add a pound of coffee beans," she said, making a sudden decision, "and some sugar." McCready raised his eyebrows but complied without comment. As Hannah paid for her purchases and arranged for them to be loaded into her wagon, she debated with herself. It would be foolish to seek out Hank and Lily. Whatever difficulties they were facing, they weren't her concern. Yet after her wagon was loaded, Hannah found herself walking not back toward the road home but deeper into town, toward the row of boarding houses that lined the street nearest the mine entrance. She told herself she was merely curious, perhaps concerned about the child's health after her fever. Simmons' boarding house was a three-story structure, once painted white, but now grayed with the constant dust from the nearby mine. Hannah hesitated at the front steps, second-guessing her impulse. But before she could retreat, the door opened and a harried-looking woman emerged, a wailing bundle in her arms. "I can't do it anymore, Mr. Jameson," the woman was saying to someone still inside. "I've got paying customers threatening to leave. You'll have to find other arrangements." Hank appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with exhaustion. He reached for Lily, who continued to cry even as he took her from the woman's arms. "I understand, Mrs. Simmons. I'll figure something out." Hannah stepped forward before she could reconsider. "Mr. Jameson." Both Hank and Mrs. Simmons turned at her voice. Surprise, then relief washed over Hank's features. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "I didn't expect to see you in town." Mrs. Simmons looked between them with undisguised curiosity. "You know each other. We're acquainted," Hannah replied neutrally. To Hank, she said, "How is Lily faring?" Hank bounced his crying daughter gently. "Not well, as you can hear. She won't settle, barely sleeps." He lowered his voice. "And now it seems we're without lodging." Mrs. Simmons had the grace to look somewhat embarrassed. "It's not personal, Mr. Jameson, but I run a business and a crying baby isn't good for business." Hannah studied the infant's red face, the way she arched her back in discomfort. "She might have colic," she observed. "My son had it. Chamomile tea sometimes helps and warm compresses on the belly." As soon as the words left her mouth, Hannah realized her mistake. She never spoke of her son, not to anyone. She hadn't even told Hank she'd had a child during their brief stay. If Hank noticed the slip, he gave no sign, his attention fully on his daughter. "I'll try anything at this point. We're both at wit's end." Mrs. Simmons cleared her throat. "As I was saying, Mr. Jameson, you'll need to find other arrangements by tonight." Hannah looked at the boarding house owner's unsympathetic face, then at Hank's exhausted one. A voice in the back of her mind, the voice of 8 years of careful isolation, screamed a warning. But watching Lily's distress and Hank's desperate attempts to soothe her, Hannah found herself speaking words she never thought would cross her lips. "You can stay with me." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise. Hank's, Mrs. Simmons, and even little Lily's, whose cries momentarily subsided as if shocked by the offer. "I what?" Hank asked, clearly thinking he'd misheard. Hannah straightened her shoulders. "You and Lily can stay at my place, until you find suitable arrangements in town." She added hastily, "There's the old bunkhouse my husband built for hired hands. It needs some work, but it's sound. You'd have your privacy." Mrs. Simmons' expression shifted from surprise to speculation, her eyes darting between Hannah and Hank. Hannah could practically see the gossip forming behind the woman's eyes. "That's very generous, Mrs. Morgan," Hank said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not generosity," Hannah replied, perhaps too sharply. "It's practicality. The child needs stability, and you need rest if you're to work effectively. I have the space." She hesitated, then added, "And I know something about caring for colicky infants." The admission hung in the air between them, an unintentional revelation of her past. Hank seemed to understand the significance, his expression softening. "If you're certain," he said at last, "just until I can make other arrangements." Hannah nodded, already wondering what madness had possessed her to make such an offer. "I have supplies to collect from Macready's. Meet me there when you're ready to depart." Without waiting for a response, Hannah turned and walked away, her heart pounding with the enormity of what she'd just done. After 8 years of carefully maintained solitude, she had just invited a stranger and his infant daughter to stay on her property indefinitely. "You've lost your mind, Hannah Morgan," she muttered to herself as she strode back toward the general store. Yet beneath the self-recrimination was something else, a flutter of something that felt uncomfortably like anticipation. An hour later, Hannah sat in her wagon outside McCready's, waiting as Hank loaded his few possessions alongside her supplies. He worked efficiently, securing each item with the care of a man used to life on the move. Lily, momentarily calm, watched from a sling across his chest. The ride back to Hannah's homestead passed mostly in silence, broken only by Lily's occasional fussing and Hank's murmured reassurances. Hannah kept her eyes on the road, acutely aware of the man sitting beside her on the wagon bench, his size, his warmth, the gentle rumble of his voice as he spoke to his daughter. "I appreciate this, Mrs. Morgan," Hank said as Hannah's cabin came into view. "More than I can say." Hannah flicked the reins, urging the horses forward. "It's temporary," she reminded him, "and you'll be staying in the bunkhouse, not the cabin." "Of course," Hank agreed readily. "I wouldn't expect otherwise." The bunkhouse stood about 50 yards from the main cabin, a simple, one-room structure with a small porch. Hannah hadn't entered it in years, using it primarily for storage. As she led Hank inside, she noted with some embarrassment the layer of dust covering everything and the musty smell of disuse. "Like I said, it needs work," she said, pushing open the shuttered windows to let in fresh air. "But the roof doesn't leak, and the stove works." Hank set down his bags, looking around at the sparse accommodations: 2 simple bunks, a small table with chairs, a potbelly stove in the corner. "It's more than adequate, thank you." Hannah nodded stiffly. "I'll leave you to get settled. There's a pump behind the cabin for water." She turned to go, but Hank's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Morgan, Hannah, why are you doing this?" Hannah paused in the doorway, considering the question. Why indeed? She'd spent 8 years avoiding entanglements, connections, anything that might breach the walls she'd built around her grief. "I told you," she said finally. "It's practical. The child needs proper care." Hank shifted Lily in his arms. "There's more to it than that." Hannah met his gaze, struck again by the clarity of his blue eyes. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but that's all I'm willing to say on the matter." With that, she left him standing in the dusty bunkhouse, retreating to the familiar sanctuary of her cabin. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth of his observation. There was more to it, a pull toward this man and his child that defied the careful boundaries she'd maintained for so long. "It's temporary," she reminded herself firmly. "Just until they find something suitable in town." But as Hannah moved through the familiar routine of her evening chores, she couldn't ignore the awareness of their presence nearby, the occasional glimpse of Hank through the bunkhouse window, as he cleaned and arranged the space, the sound of Lily's cries carrying on the evening breeze. Her solitude, so carefully preserved for 8 years, had been irrevocably disrupted. And despite all her misgivings, Hannah couldn't quite convince herself that she regretted it. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect early spring day in the Colorado high country. Hannah rose with the sun, as was her habit, and was surprised to find Hank already at the chopping block, splitting wood with practiced efficiency. Lily, she noted, was secured in a makeshift carrier fashioned from a wooden crate lined with blankets, placed safely away from flying wood chips but within her father's sight. Hannah paused in her doorway, watching the scene. There was something almost domestic about it, a man chopping wood while his child looked on, the smoke from her chimney curling into the morning air. For a moment, it reminded her so powerfully of her life. Before that, she nearly retreated back into the cabin. Instead, she stepped fully outside. "You're up early," she called. Hank paused mid-swing. "Hope I didn't wake you. Lily was fussing at dawn, so we decided to be productive." "How did she sleep?" Hannah asked, approaching the crate to check on the infant. "Better after I tried that chamomile tea you suggested." Hank set down the axe and wiped his brow. She still woke several times but settled more easily. Hannah nodded, pleased despite herself. "Good. Are you heading to the mine today?" "Yes, my shift starts at noon." Hank hesitated. "I haven't found anyone willing to watch her while I work. Mrs. Simmons was the only one and, well..." Hannah knew what he was asking without him having to say it. "I can watch her," she said, the words coming easier than she expected. "But only until you make permanent arrangements." Relief washed over Hank's features. "Thank you. I promise I'm looking for a more permanent solution. See that you do." Hannah straightened, adopting a more businesslike tone. "Breakfast is cooking. You're welcome to join me before you head to town." Over a simple meal of biscuits and gravy, Hannah explained her daily routine to Hank and how Lily would fit into it. "I'll be working in the garden most of the day. She can be with me there. If she gets fussy, I have remedies that might help." Hank nodded gratefully. "She's usually good during the day. It's nights that are hardest." When it came time for Hank to leave for his shift, Hannah witnessed a moment of hesitation as he handed Lily over. It was the first time since her mother's death, Hannah realized, that Hank had entrusted his daughter to someone else's care for an extended period. "She'll be fine," Hannah assured him, taking the baby with more confidence than she felt. "I raised a child before. I remember how." The admission slipped out easily this time, less painful than she'd expected. Hank nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper. "I know she's in good hands," he said. With a final caress of his daughter's cheek, he mounted his horse and rode toward town. Left alone with Lily, Hannah experienced a moment of panic. What had she been thinking? She hadn't cared for an infant in over a decade, and the last time. None of that, she told herself firmly. The past is past. Settling Lily into the carrier Hank had fashioned, Hannah brought her to the garden where spring planting awaited. Throughout the day, as Hannah worked the soil and planted the seeds that would feed her through the coming winter, she found herself talking to Lily, explaining what she was doing, naming the vegetables, even humming old lullabies she thought she'd forgotten. Lily proved to be an attentive audience, watching Hannah with curious eyes when awake and sleeping peacefully in the dappled shade when tired. Only once did she become truly fussy, her face reddening with discomfort. Hannah promptly prepared a warm compress as she'd suggested to Hank, gently massaging Lily's tiny belly until the discomfort passed. "There now," Hannah murmured, cradling the now calm infant. "Not so difficult, are you?" As the day progressed, Hannah found herself slipping with surprising ease back into the rhythms of caring for a child. The weight of Lily in her arms, the soft sounds of her breathing, the way her tiny fingers curled reflexively around Hannah's, all of it awakened memories that were bittersweet but no longer unbearable. By the time Hank returned at dusk, Hannah had completed her planting, fed and settled her livestock, prepared supper, and was sitting in her rocking chair with a sleeping Lily nestled against her chest. Hank entered the cabin with obvious apprehension, his face smudged with coal dust from the mine, his shoulders tense with worry. When he saw the peaceful tableau before him, the tension visibly drained from his body. "How was she?" he asked softly, removing his hat. Hannah smiled despite herself. "A perfect angel, most of the time. We had one episode of colic, but the compress helped." Hank crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside the rocking chair to gaze at his sleeping daughter. The tenderness in his expression as he brushed a finger across Lily's cheek stirred something in Hannah that she thought had died with her family. "And how was the mine?" she asked, to distract herself from the unwelcome emotion. "Hard work, but good pay," Hank replied, his eyes still on Lily. "The foreman was pleased with my experience, says I might advance quickly if I prove myself." "That's good," Hannah said, suddenly aware of how close Hank was, of the faint scent of earth and sweat that clung to him. "I, made supper. You should eat before it gets cold." Hank straightened, seeming to become aware of their proximity as well. "I should wash up first," he said. "Don't want to get coal dust all over your clean home." As he stepped outside to use the pump, Hannah found herself studying Lily's peaceful face, struck by how natural it felt to hold her. One day, she reminded herself, that was all it had taken to crack open the door she'd kept so firmly closed on her maternal instincts. "Dangerous," she whispered to the sleeping infant. "You and your father are very dangerous to my peace of mind." When Hank returned, face and hands scrubbed clean, Hannah reluctantly transferred Lily to his arms. "She's been fed and changed. Should sleep a while longer." They ate together at Hannah's small table, the conversation flowing more easily than Hannah would have expected. Hank told her about the mine, the men he'd met, the work he'd been assigned. Hannah, in turn, found herself sharing details about her garden, the new techniques she was trying this year, her plans for expanding her chicken coop. It was the longest conversation she'd had with another adult in years, and Hannah was surprised to find she enjoyed it. Hank was an attentive listener, asking intelligent questions and offering thoughtful observations. His presence filled her small cabin in a way that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. As the evening wound down, Hank prepared to return to the bunkhouse with Lily. At the door, he paused. "Hannah," he said, using her given name for the first time that day. "Thank you. Not just for watching Lily, but for everything." Hannah nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with his gratitude. "Like I said, it's temporary." "Of course," Hank agreed, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Good night, then." "Good night," Hannah replied, watching as he carried Lily across the yard to the bunkhouse, his broad back illuminated by the rising moon. As she closed her door and prepared for bed, Hannah tried to ignore the emptiness of her cabin, the silence that had once been comforting but now felt oddly hollow. One day, she told herself, that was all it had taken to disrupt 8 years of carefully cultivated solitude. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as Hannah drifted off to sleep, she found herself wondering what the next day would bring. Days stretched into a week, then 2. Against her own expectations, Hannah fell into a comfortable rhythm with Hank and Lily. Each morning, Hank would complete whatever chores he could before heading to the mine, returning in the evening to share supper with Hannah before retiring to the bunkhouse with his daughter. During the days, Hannah found herself enjoying Lily's company as she worked around the homestead. The infant's presence added a dimension to her routine that Hannah hadn't realized she missed someone to talk to explain things to share the small victories and frustrations of homestead life. "See these beans?" Hannah would say, holding up a seedling for Lily's inspection from her shaded spot in the garden. "By summer, they'll be taller than your father." Lily would gurgle in response, her dark eyes tracking Hannah's movements with infant curiosity. Sometimes, when Hannah spoke of certain things, the best way to predict weather from cloud patterns, how to tell when a chicken was about to lay, she would catch herself using the same words she'd once used with her son. The realization would bring a momentary pang, but no longer the crushing grief that had once accompanied such memories. The changes in Lily over those 2 weeks were remarkable. Her colic episodes became less frequent, and she began to sleep for longer stretches at night, much to Hank's relief. She smiled more readily, especially when Hannah sang to her or told her stories while working. Changes in Hank were equally noticeable. The exhaustion that had lined his face when they first met gradually eased. He gained confidence at the mine, returning each evening with tales of his work and the respect he was earning among the other miners. He began taking more initiative around the homestead as well, repairing fences, reinforcing the chicken coop, and even building a proper cradle for Lily from wood he salvaged around the property. "You didn't have to do that," Hannah said when he presented the cradle one evening, beautifully crafted with smooth edges and a gentle rocking motion. "I wanted to," Hank replied, watching as Hannah placed Lily in his creation. "You've done so much for us. It seemed a small way to repay you." The cradle was far from small. It represented hours of work after already long days at the mine. Hannah ran her hand along its polished rail, touched by the gesture in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "You have skill with woodworking." "My father was a carpenter before he took up ranching," Hank explained. "He made sure I learned the basics." He hesitated, then added, "Your work is finer, though. I saw the chest in your bedroom, the one with the carved wildflowers. That's craftsmanship." Hannah was surprised he'd noticed. "My husband taught me," she said. "After he died, I kept at it. It helps to have something to focus on during the long winters." It was the most she'd revealed about her past since Hank and Lily had arrived, and the admission hung in the air between them. Hank seemed to sense the significance, his expression thoughtful. "Loss shapes us," he said quietly. "Sometimes I think Lily is the only reason I kept moving forward after her mother died." Hannah nodded, understanding completely. Children give us purpose when nothing else can. The moment stretched between them, a shared recognition of similar grief. Then Lily cooed from her new cradle, breaking the tension. Hannah stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I should start supper," she said, moving toward the stove. Hank nodded, respecting her need for distance. "I'll finish up with the horses." As the days passed, Hannah found herself watching Hank more often, the careful way he handled Lily, the strength in his hands as he worked around the homestead, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to her. She noticed other things too, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, how his smile transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. These observations troubled her. Hannah had long ago resigned herself to solitude, convinced that the pain of loss outweighed any joy companionship might bring. Yet here she was, finding herself drawn to this man and his child in ways that threatened the careful walls she'd built around her heart. One evening, as they sat on Hannah's porch watching the sunset after Lily had been put to bed in her new cradle, Hank broke their comfortable silence with a question. "Have you ever thought of remarrying, Hannah?" The question caught her off guard. "No," she answered reflexively. "Then more honestly, at least not for many years." Hank nodded, his gaze fixed on the mountains turned golden by the setting sun. "I didn't think I would either after Rachel died. It seemed disloyal somehow." Hannah understood the sentiment all too well. "Yes. As if moving forward means forgetting." "Exactly." Hank turned to look at her, his expression serious. "But lately, I've been wondering if that's true, if perhaps honoring their memory might mean finding joy again." The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Hannah felt a flutter of panic. This was precisely what she'd feared: connection, attachment, the possibility of loss. She stood abruptly. "I should check on Lily," she said, though they both knew the baby was sleeping peacefully. Hank didn't try to stop her, But as Hannah retreated into the cabin, she felt his gaze follow her patient, understanding but with something else beneath it. Something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Later that night, after Hank had returned to the bunkhouse, Hannah sat by her window, watching the moonlight cast shadows across her yard. 3 weeks had passed since the stormy night when a cowboy and his infant daughter had appeared at her door. 3 weeks that had somehow begun to unravel 8 years of determined isolation. "This isn't what you planned," she told herself sternly. "Remember why you chose this life." But as Hannah finally retired to bed, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps it was time to consider a different path, one that included the man and child who had so unexpectedly entered her life. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, a perfect late spring day in the Colorado mountains. Hank had no shift at the mine, and after completing the morning chores together, an unusual restlessness seemed to settle over both of them. "It's too fine a day to stay cooped up," Hank observed, watching as Hannah hung laundry on the line behind the cabin. Lily lay on a blanket nearby, kicking her legs in the dappled sunlight. "What do you say to a picnic?" Hannah paused, a damp sheet in her hands. "A picnic? There must be some nice spots nearby." Hank gestured toward the rolling hills that surrounded Hannah's homestead. "A creek or a meadow where we could spend a few hours." The suggestion was so unexpected, so normal, that Hannah found herself nodding before she could overthink it. "There's a nice spot about a mile east where the creek widens. Good shade trees." "Perfect," Hank said with a smile that made Hannah's stomach do an uncomfortable flip. "I'll saddle the horses if you'll pack some food." An hour later, they were riding side by side toward the creek, Lily securely nestled in a sling across Hank's broad chest. Hannah led the way, acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd done something purely for pleasure. Her trips to town were always for necessities, her rare ventures beyond her property always with a purpose: hunting, gathering herbs, checking boundary fences. The spot she'd chosen was one of her favorites, a small clearing beside a bend in the creek where cottonwoods provided ample shade and wildflowers dotted the grass in colorful profusion. As they dismounted and Hank spread a blanket brought from the cabin, Hannah found herself suddenly shy, unsure of the protocols for such an outing. "This is perfect," Hank said, settling Lily on the blanket and unpacking the simple lunch Hannah had prepared: bread, cheese, cold chicken, and early spring berries she'd gathered the day before. They ate in companionable silence for a while, listening to the gurgle of the creek and the rustle of leaves overhead. Lily, content after her feeding, dozed between them on the blanket. "You know," Hank said eventually, "in the 3 weeks we've been here, you've never really told me your story." Hannah tensed slightly. "There's not much to tell." "I think there is," Hank countered gently. "A woman living alone on a successful homestead for 8 years. That's not a common tale." Hannah was silent for so long that Hank began to think she wouldn't answer. Then, her eyes on the sleeping infant rather than on him, she began to speak. "My husband Nathan and I came out here from Pennsylvania in '64. The war was still on, and we wanted no part of it. Nathan had been injured at Antietam, not badly, but enough to get him discharged. We thought we could make a fresh start out west." She paused, running her fingers through the grass beside the blanket. "We did well at first, built the cabin, started clearing fields. Our son James was born in '66. We were happy." The words seemed to catch in her throat. Hank remained silent, giving her space to continue. "In '67, influenza swept through this part of the territory. It came on so suddenly. One day James had a slight cough, the next he was burning with fever. Nathan caught it while caring for him. I nursed them both for days, but—" She swallowed hard. I buried them on the same day behind the cabin where the aspen grove starts. I'm sorry, Hannah, Hank said softly. Hannah shook her head. It was a long time ago. Everyone told me to sell the homestead, move back east or at least into town. But this place was all I had left of them, so I stayed, learned to do everything Nathan had done, built a life alone. And in 8 years you never thought of leaving, of starting over elsewhere. Where would I go? Hannah asked simply. This is my home, their home. Hank nodded, understanding. After Rachel died in childbirth, I couldn't stay in our cabin in Montana. Too many memories. So I took Lily and started traveling south, taking work where I could find it. I told myself I was looking for a place to settle, but really, I think I was just running. And now? Hannah asked, meeting his gaze directly for the first time during their conversation. Now I'm not so sure running is the answer, Hank replied. These past weeks, watching you. You've built something here, Hannah, something strong and true despite your loss. It's made me think about what I want for Lily, for myself. Hannah looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. We should head back soon. Clouds are building over the mountains. Hank accepted the change of subject with grace, but as they packed up their picnic and mounted their horses for the return journey, Hannah could feel something had shifted between them. She had shared her story, opened a door she had kept firmly closed for 8 years. And Hank, with his quiet strength and gentle understanding, had walked right through it. The following week brought changes to their established routine. Hank was promoted to shift supervisor at the mine, a position that came with better pay but longer hours. Hannah found herself caring for Lily for longer stretches, and to her surprise, she didn't mind. The infant had become a bright spot in her days, her progress a source of genuine joy. She rolled over today, Hannah reported one evening as Hank returned from the mine. All by herself, from back to front. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Hank's face lit up at the news. Did she really? That's my girl. He swept Lily up from her cradle, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he praised his daughter for her accomplishment. Hannah watched them together, a familiar ache in her chest, not quite pain, but a bittersweet recognition of what she'd lost and what, perhaps, she might find again. As May gave way to June, the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. Hannah's garden thrived, the young plants stretching toward the summer sun. The repairs and improvements Hank had made to the outbuildings gave the entire property a renewed sense of purpose. Even the bunkhouse had been transformed from a dusty storage space to a proper living quarters, though Hank and Lily spent most of their waking hours in the main cabin with Hannah. In town, people had begun to notice the arrangement. Hannah's monthly trips for supplies now included Hank and Lily, and the three of them together attracted curious glances and whispered comments. Hannah pretended not to notice, but she was acutely aware of the speculation their unusual household was generating. Mrs. Simmons asked me today if we had set a date, Hank mentioned casually one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. Hannah nearly choked on her tea. A date? For what? Our wedding, Hank replied, his expression amused. Apparently, the good citizens of Silver Peak have decided we're secretly engaged. That's ridiculous, Hannah sputtered. We're not, I mean, you're just staying here temporarily while you find proper accommodations in town. It's been over a month, Hank pointed out mildly. And I haven't exactly been looking for other accommodations. The admission hung in the air between them. It was true, Hannah realized. Neither of them had mentioned Hank and Lily leaving in weeks. Somehow, their temporary arrangement had evolved into something that felt increasingly permanent. What did you tell Mrs. Simmons? Hannah asked finally. I told her it wasn't her business, Hank replied, but I also didn't correct her assumption. Hannah looked at him sharply. "Why not?" Hank met her gaze steadily. "Because I'm not sure I want to leave, Hannah. And I don't think you want us to, either." The directness of his statement took her breath away. It was true, the thought of the cabin without Lily's laughter, without Hank's steady presence, had become increasingly difficult to imagine. Somewhere along the way, they had become essential to her life in a way that terrified and exhilarated her. Hannah began, then faltered. "This is happening too fast." Hank reached across the space between their chairs, his large hand covering hers. "Is it? Or has it been building since that first night when you opened your door to us in the storm?" Hannah couldn't answer. The warmth of his hand on hers, the earnestness in his blue eyes, the truth of his words, it was all too overwhelming. She pulled her hand away and stood. "I need time, Hank. I never planned for this." "I know," Hank said softly. "Neither did I, but here we are." Here they were indeed, Hannah thought as she retreated into the cabin, leaving Hank on the porch. A woman who had chosen solitude, a man who had been running from his grief, and a child who had somehow brought them together. It was like something from one of the dime novels sold at Macready's store, too neat, too perfect. Yet as Hannah prepared for bed that night, she couldn't deny the rightness she felt when the three of them were together, the sense of completeness that had been missing from her life for so long. Was she brave enough to reach for it? To risk her heart again after so many years of careful protection? The question haunted her as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of storms and sanctuary, of loss and unexpected second chances. The summer solstice arrived with a burst of activity around Silver Peak. The town planned a celebration, a dance in the newly constructed meeting hall, followed by a picnic the next day. Such events were rare enough in the mining community to generate considerable excitement. "Will you go?" Hank asked Hannah as they worked together in the garden, Lily napping in the shade nearby. "To the dance, I mean." Hannah paused in her weeding, wiping sweat from her brow. "I haven't attended a town social in years." "Maybe it's time to change that," Hank suggested. He hesitated, then added, "I'd be honored to escort you if you'd allow it." The formal phrasing made Hannah smile despite herself. "And what about Lily?" Mrs. Jenkins from the assay office offered to mind the children during the dance. "Her daughter's helping." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "You've given this some thought." "I have," Hank admitted. "I think it would be good for us to participate in community life a bit more." Hannah returned to her weeding, considering the invitation. The thought of attending a social event after so many years of isolation was daunting. Yet there was something appealing about the idea of an evening of music, and perhaps dancing, especially with Hank as her escort. "I'll think about it," she said finally. That evening, after Hank and Lily had retired to the bunkhouse, Hannah opened the trunk at the foot of her bed for the first time in years. Beneath layers of carefully preserved memories, James's first baby clothes, Nathan's pocket watch, letters from family back east, lay her best dress, wrapped in muslin to protect it from dust and moths. Hannah lifted it out, shaking the folds carefully. The dark blue calico with its subtle pattern of white flowers had been her Sunday best, worn to church and social gatherings during those first years in Colorado. She'd had no occasion to wear it since the funerals. Holding it against herself, Hannah moved to the small mirror hanging beside her bed. The dress would still fit, she thought, though it might need taking in at the waist. 8 years of hard physical labor had whittled away the softness of her younger days. As she studied her reflection, Hannah barely recognized the woman looking back at her. At 32, she was still handsome, her brown hair streaked with a few strands of silver at the temples, her face tanned and lined from outdoor work, but still youthful in its way. It was her eyes that had changed the most, once soft with happiness, then hardened by grief, now showing something new: uncertainty, possibility, hope. "You're being ridiculous," Hannah told her reflection. "It's just a dance." But as she carefully refolded the dress, she knew it was far more than that. Accepting Hank's invitation meant stepping back into the world she'd abandoned 8 years ago, acknowledging that perhaps her self-imposed exile had run its course. The next morning at breakfast, Hannah announced her decision. "I'll go to the dance," she said, setting a plate of biscuits on the table, "if the offer still stands." Hank's face lit up with a smile that made Hannah's heart skip. "It does." "I'll need to make some adjustments to my dress," she added, trying to sound practical rather than nervous. "It's been a while since I've worn it." "I'm sure you'll look beautiful," Hank said, his gaze warm as it met hers across the table. Hannah looked away, flustered by the compliment. "Yes, well, it's settled then." The days leading up to the solstice dance took on a new dimension of anticipation. Hannah spent her evenings altering her dress, taking in the waist and refreshing the lace at the collar and cuffs. She even ventured into the trunk again to find the cameo brooch that had been a wedding gift from Nathan's mother. The night of the dance arrived clear and warm, the long summer twilight bathing the mountains in golden light as Hannah prepared in her bedroom. She'd washed her hair that morning, letting it dry in the sun, and now she arranged it in a style more elaborate than her usual practical braid, pinning it up with combs found in the depths of her trunk. The dress fit well after her alterations, the dark blue flattering against her sun-bronzed skin. The cameo sat at her throat, a tangible connection to her past as she prepared to step into a different future. When a knock came at the cabin door, Hannah took a deep breath and went to answer it. Hank stood on the porch, Lily in his arms, both of them dressed in their best clothes. Hank had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and wore a clean white shirt with a string tie beneath his best vest. The sight of him made Hannah's breath catch. "You look." Hank seemed at a loss for words as he took in Hannah's appearance. "Hannah, you're stunning." Hannah felt a blush rise to her cheeks, unaccustomed to such open admiration. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Jameson." The ride into town was filled with a nervous energy that neither of them addressed directly. Lily, sensing the excitement, babbled happily from her secure position in Hank's lap, reaching occasionally for the shiny buttons on his vest. Silver Peak was transformed for the celebration. Lanterns hung from every available post, casting a warm glow over the main street. The new meeting hall had been decorated with paper streamers and wildflowers, and a small band was setting up on a raised platform at one end of the room. As Hank helped Hannah down from the wagon, she felt a moment of panic at the thought of facing the entire town after years of minimal contact. But Hank's steady presence beside her, his hand warm at the small of her back, gave her the courage to continue. They delivered Lily to Mrs. Jenkins, who had set up a nursery area in a side room of the hall for the youngest residents of Silver Peak. Then, with a reassuring smile, Hank led Hannah into the main hall where the celebration was beginning. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused, heads turned, and Hannah felt the weight of curious stares. But before the attention could become overwhelming, the band struck up a lively tune, and Hank leaned close. "Would you honor me with this dance, Mrs. Morgan?" The formality of his request, coupled with the twinkle in his blue eyes, made Hannah smile despite her nervousness. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Jameson, though I should warn you, it's been many years since I've danced." "Then we'll remember together," Hank replied, leading her onto the floor. At first, Hannah moved stiffly, hyper-aware of watching eyes and her own rusty skills. But as the music continued and Hank guided her with confident steps, she began to relax, remembering the joy she'd once found in such simple pleasures. By the third dance, Hannah was laughing as Hank twirled her through a particularly energetic reel, her earlier self-consciousness forgotten. When they finally paused for refreshment, Hannah was flushed and breathless, but happier than she'd been in years. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed dancing," she admitted as Hank handed her a cup of punch. "You're a natural," Hank replied. "I'm having trouble keeping up." The evening progressed in a blur of music, laughter, and increasingly comfortable conversation with townspeople Hannah had kept at arm's length for years. She accepted compliments on her garden from the mercantile owner's wife, discussed chicken breeds with a farmer from outside town, and even found herself promising to contribute preserves to the harvest festival in autumn. Through it all, Hank remained at her side, his pride in her evident in every introduction, every shared smile. When he wasn't dancing with Hannah, he conversed easily with the miners and businessmen, respected for his position at the mine and his obvious integrity. As the evening drew to a close, the band shifted to slower, more romantic melodies. Hank led Hannah onto the floor once more, but this dance was different, closer, more intimate. His hand at her waist drew her nearer than propriety strictly allowed, and Hannah found she didn't mind. "Thank you for coming tonight," Hank said softly, his voice for her ears alone. "Seeing you like this happy, laughing, it's the most beautiful sight I've ever witnessed." Hannah looked up at him, struck by the sincerity in his expression. "I didn't think I could feel this way again," she admitted. "After everything, I thought that part of me was gone forever." "Nothing that fundamental ever truly leaves us," Hank replied. "It just waits for the right time, the right person to bring it back to life." The music swelled around them, but Hannah barely heard it. All she could focus on was Hank's face above hers, his eyes asking a question she was finally ready to answer. When his head dipped slightly, she rose to meet him, their lips touching in a kiss that was gentle yet profound, an acknowledgement of shared grief, of unexpected connection, of hope for a future neither had dared imagine. Around them, the dance continued, but for Hannah and Hank, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, standing on the precipice of something new and wonderful. Later, as they collected a sleepy Lily and drove back to the homestead under a canopy of stars, Hannah's head rested comfortably against Hank's shoulder. No words were needed. The shift in their relationship had been acknowledged, accepted, embraced. As Hank helped her down from the wagon in front of her cabin, their cabin, as she'd begun to think of it, he paused, Lily sleeping peacefully in his other arm. "I know this is all happening faster than you expected," he said quietly. "If you need more time." Hannah shook her head. "I've had 8 years of solitude, Hank. I don't need more time to know what I want." With that, she reached up to touch his face, drawing him down for another kiss, this one bolder, more certain. When they parted, Hank's smile was brilliant even in the moonlight. "Stay in the cabin tonight," Hannah said softly. "Both of you, no more bunkhouse." It was an invitation that went beyond the practical, and they both knew it. Hank nodded, his expression solemn despite the joy in his eyes. "I would be honored," he replied. "For tonight, and for as many nights as you'll have us." As they entered the cabin together, Hannah felt the last of her reservations fade away. The home she had maintained alone for so long felt more complete with Hank and Lily within its walls, as if they had always been meant to be there, filling the empty spaces grief had left behind. The summer unfolded in a haze of happiness that Hannah had never thought to experience again. Days were filled with shared work, tending the expanding garden, caring for livestock, making improvements to the homestead that reflected their growing commitment to a shared future. Evenings brought quiet intimacy, supper together, stories exchanged, Lily's bedtime rituals, and later, the private moments between Hannah and Hank that deepened their connection. In town, Their relationship was accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some, like Mrs. Simmons, viewed their unorthodox beginning with suspicion. Others, seeing their obvious happiness, were more supportive. "When's the wedding?" became a common question, one that Hannah and Hank discussed privately but had yet to answer publicly. "There's no rush," Hank said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lily playing with wooden blocks at their feet. "We know what we have. A ceremony won't change that." Hannah appreciated his patience, his willingness to let their relationship evolve at a pace that respected her lingering hesitations. Though she had opened her heart and home to Hank and Lily, there remained a part of her that feared formalizing their connection, as if doing so might somehow invite the same tragedy that had befallen her first family. Yet as summer ripened toward autumn, bringing with it the harvest and the changing colors of the aspen groves, Hannah found her fears gradually receding. Watching Hank with Lily, the way he encouraged her first tentative attempts at crawling, his boundless patience when she was fussy, the love that shone in his eyes with every interaction, Hannah couldn't imagine her life without them. One crisp September morning, as Hannah gathered the last of the summer vegetables from the garden, Lily practicing her new crawling skills on a blanket nearby, she made a decision. That evening, after Lily was asleep and Hank was relaxing by the fire, Hannah took a deep breath and spoke the words she'd been considering for weeks. "I think we should get married before winter," she said, her hands busy with her mending but her eyes steady on Hank's face. "If you still want to, that is." Hank set aside the bridle he'd been repairing, his expression serious. "Hannah, nothing would make me happier, but I need to know, are you certain? I don't want you to feel rushed or pressured." Hannah set down her needle, considering her answer carefully. "For 8 years I lived in the shadow of what I'd lost. I convinced myself that isolation was safer than connection, that memories were enough." She met his gaze directly. "You and Lily showed me how wrong I was. You brought me back to life, Hank, and yes, I'm certain." The joy that spread across Hank's face was answer enough, but he rose and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside her and taking her hands in his. "Hannah Morgan," he said solemnly, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife and Lily's mother?" The formal proposal, unnecessary though it was after her own declaration, brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "with all my heart, yes." They were married on the first Sunday in October, with the aspen groves blazing gold against the deep blue Colorado sky. The ceremony took place at Hannah's homestead, their homestead, with Reverend Tompkins from Silver Peak officiating. The guest list was small but meaningful. Miners who had become Hank's friends, townspeople with whom Hannah had cautiously renewed connections, and a few neighbors from outlying homesteads who had watched Hannah's solitary existence with concern over the years. Hannah wore her blue dress, freshly altered again, and adorned with new lace collar and cuffs she'd purchased specially for the occasion. Lily, now proficient at crawling and beginning to pull herself up on furniture, wore a dress Hannah had sewn from the same fabric as the new curtains she'd made for their bedroom, a symbol of the home they were creating together. Hank, standing tall and proud beside the arbor he'd built for the occasion, watched with undisguised adoration as Hannah walked toward him across the yard, they decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons. In that moment, with the sun warming her shoulders and Hank's smile warming her heart, Hannah felt the last shadows of her grief recede, making way for the brightness of this new chapter. "We gather here today," Reverend Tompkins began, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, and to celebrate the family they have already begun to build together." The words were traditional, but the circumstances were not. and Hannah appreciated the Reverend's acknowledgement of their unconventional path. As she and Hank exchanged vows, Hannah felt a profound sense of rightness, not a replacement of what she'd lost, but a new beginning that honored rather than erased her past. "I, Hannah Morgan, take you, Hank Jameson, as my husband," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "To love and cherish through all life seasons, to partner with in building our home and raising our children, and to honor the journey that brought us together." When Hank repeated similar vows, his deep voice carrying across the assembled guests, Hannah saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. And when he spoke of our daughter Lily and any children with whom we may be blessed, Hannah felt a surge of maternal love so powerful it took her breath away. The kiss that sealed their vows was gentle yet profound, a promise, a commitment, a declaration to the world that they had found in each other a second chance at happiness neither had thought possible. The celebration that followed was joyful and relaxed, with tables set up under the trees and food contributed by neighbors and friends. Lily was passed from arm to arm, the center of attention in her pretty dress, charming everyone with her newfound ability to wave and her infectious laugh. Late in the afternoon, as the party began to wind down, Hannah found herself standing slightly apart, watching as Hank spoke with a group of minors, Lily perched on his hip. The sight of them together, her husband, her daughter, filled Hannah with a contentment she hadn't felt in nearly a decade. "He's a good man," a voice said beside her. Hannah turned to find Mrs. Jenkins, the assay office manager's wife who had watched Lily during the midsummer dance. "He is," Hannah agreed. "And you deserve happiness, my dear," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "We've all worried about you out here alone all these years." Hannah was surprised by the comment. "You have, of course. A community looks after its own even when they try to keep their distance." The older woman patted Hannah's arm. "I'm glad you found your way back to us." As Mrs. Jenkins moved away to help with the clearing up, Hannah considered her words. She had thought herself separate from Silver Peak and its inhabitants for so long, defined by her isolation. Yet here they were, celebrating with her, expressing a concern she hadn't realized existed. That evening, after the guests had departed and Lily was asleep in her crib, moved into the small second bedroom that Hannah had begun clearing out weeks ago, Hannah and Hank stood together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. "Happy?" Hank asked, his arm around her waist drawing her close against his side. "More than I thought possible," Hannah replied honestly. She hesitated, then added, "I was so afraid, Hank, for so long, afraid to care, to connect, to risk losing everything again." "I know," Hank said softly. "So was I after Rachel died. Taking Lily and leaving Montana was as much about running from grief as finding a new start." Hannah turned in his embrace to face him. "And now," Hank's smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face, "now I'm not running anymore. I've found where I belong with you, with our family." "Our family," Hannah repeated, savoring the phrase. "It feels right, doesn't it? The three of us." "It does," Hank agreed. "Though perhaps someday it might be 4 of us or even 5. The idea of more children, siblings for Lily, new life in a home that had known too much loss, made Hannah's heart swell with both anticipation and a touch of anxiety. But looking up at Hank's face, illuminated by the last light of their wedding day, Hannah knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Someday." Hank's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise of passion, of partnership, of the life they were building together. As Hannah melted into his embrace, she sent a silent acknowledgement to the ghosts of her past. Nathan, James, the woman she had been before grief reshaped her. They would always be part of her, but they no longer defined her future. That future now belonged to the family. She and Hank were creating a family born from loss, but sustained by love, hope, and the courage to begin again. Winter in the Colorado high country came early that year, the first heavy snow falling before Thanksgiving. But within the walls of the Jameson homestead, all was warmth and light. The cabin, once a shrine to Hannah's solitude, had been transformed by the presence of Hank and Lily, now toddling confidently from furniture to person, her vocabulary expanding daily. Hannah found joy in traditions she'd abandoned years ago, decorating the cabin with pine boughs for Christmas, baking special treats, singing carols around the fire. Hank embraced these customs with enthusiasm, building Lily a small wooden rocking horse as her Christmas gift, and presenting Hannah with a delicately carved jewelry box that must have taken him weeks of secret evening work. As winter deepened, bringing with it long nights and crystal clear, star-filled skies, Hannah and Hank settled into the comfortable rhythms of married life. Hank continued his work at the mine, now as a full-shift supervisor with responsibilities that reflected his natural leadership. Hannah maintained the homestead and cared for Lily, while also finding time for the woodworking that had sustained her during her years alone. Together, they planned for the future, discussing spring planting, the addition of more livestock, improvements to the outbuildings. They talked of adding onto the cabin, perhaps a larger kitchen or another bedroom. These conversations, filled with shared hopes and practical considerations, were among Hannah's favorite moments, evidence of the life they were building together, step by step. In February, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, Hannah shared news that would reshape their plans yet again. "I think," she said carefully, watching Hank's face in the firelight, "we might need that extra bedroom sooner rather than later." Hank looked up from the book he'd been reading, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension. "Hannah, are you saying?" She nodded, a mixture of joy and trepidation making her voice unsteady. "If my calculations are correct, we'll welcome a new addition to our family come late summer." The book fell forgotten as Hank moved to kneel beside her chair, his large hands gently cradling her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered, awe and delight mingling in his voice. "Our baby." Hannah covered his hands with her own, the reality of their creation still sinking in. After James, she had never thought to carry another child. The fear of loss had been too great, the memories too painful. Yet here she was, nurturing new life filled with cautious hope rather than dread. "Are you happy?" Hank asked, studying her face with concern. "I know this might bring back difficult memories." Hannah smiled, touched by his sensitivity. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "and overjoyed and grateful." She squeezed his hands. "Most of all, I'm grateful I don't have to do this alone." "Never alone," Hank promised, rising to gather her into his arms. "Not anymore." As spring returned to the mountains, melting the snowdrifts and coaxing new growth from the thawing earth, Hannah's body changed with the season. Her pregnancy progressed without complications, though each milestone brought both celebration and quiet moments of remembrance for the child she had lost. Lily, now nearly 18 months old and chattering constantly, seemed to understand that something significant was happening. She patted Hannah's growing belly with gentle hands, repeating "baby" with solemn concentration, as if practicing for her role as big sister. The people of Silver Peak, who had embraced Hannah's return to community life with varying degrees of enthusiasm, now showered her with practical gifts and well-meaning advice. Hannah accepted both with more grace than she might have a year earlier, recognizing the kindness behind the sometimes overwhelming attention. One warm June afternoon, as Hannah sat on the porch shelling peas with Lily helping beside her, a wagon appeared on the road leading to their homestead. Hannah shaded her eyes, recognizing Mrs. Jenkins and her daughter Emily, who had recently married one of the clerks from the assay office. "Visitors, Lily," Hannah said, setting aside her bowl of peas and smoothing her apron over her prominent belly. "Shall we welcome them?" By the time the wagon reached the yard, Hank had emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness on his day off from the mine. Together, they greeted their unexpected guests. "We hope we're not intruding," Mrs. Jenkins said, as Hank helped her down from the wagon. "But Emily and I have been working on something we wanted to deliver in person." Emily, a shy young woman of 20, carefully lifted a large basket from the wagon bed. "It's a tradition in Silver Peak," she explained, presenting the basket to Hannah. "For new mothers." Inside, Hannah found a beautiful handmade quilt, pieced together from dozens of fabric squares in a pattern of interlocking stars. Each square, Emily explained, had been contributed by a different woman from town or the surrounding homesteads. "Everyone who could sew added a piece," Mrs. Jenkins said proudly. "Even those who barely know you wanted to participate. It's a way of saying the whole community stands with you and your family." Hannah ran her fingers over the careful stitching, recognizing fabrics from dresses she'd seen worn at church or social gatherings. The gesture from women she'd held at a distance for years touched her deeply. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Mrs. Jenkins replied kindly. "Just know that you're not alone, Hannah, not anymore." The words echoed Hank's promise from the night she'd told him about the baby, and Hannah felt their truth settle deep within her. The walls she had built around herself and her grief had not simply been breached by Hank and Lily's arrival in her life. They had been completely dismantled, making room for a community she hadn't realized she needed. As summer reached its peak, Hannah's time grew near. The garden flourished under her care, promising abundant harvest in the coming months. Lily thrived as well, her vocabulary expanding daily and her curiosity about the world insatiable. Hank divided his time between the mine and home, taking on more of the physically demanding chores as Hannah's mobility decreased. In the cool pre-dawn hours of an August morning, Hannah woke to the unmistakable beginnings of labor. She lay still for a moment, breathing through the first contraction, memories of another birth, James's birth, washing over her. But where that memory had once brought only pain, now it carried a strange comfort. She had done this before. She knew what to expect. "Hank," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "It's time." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and purpose. Hank sent one of the neighbor boys for the midwife in Silver Peak, while he kept Lily occupied and provided Hannah with whatever support she needed. By mid-morning, the midwife had arrived, bringing with her the calm competence that came from decades of delivering the community's children. "You're doing beautifully," she assured Hannah after examining her. "Not your first, is it?" Hannah shook her head, sweat dampening her hair. "No. But it's been a long time." The midwife nodded, understanding. "Your body remembers even if the mind tries to forget. Trust it. It knows what to do." As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Hannah's labor intensified. Hank remained by her side, his steady presence anchoring her through the waves of pain. Outside, she could hear Lily's laughter as Mrs. Jenkins, who had arrived shortly after the midwife, kept the toddler entertained in the yard. "I can't lose this baby," Hannah whispered during a particularly difficult contraction, gripping Hank's hand with surprising strength. "I can't go through that again." "You won't," Hank promised, though they both knew it wasn't a guarantee he could make. "This child is strong, like its mother." The final stage of labor came swiftly after that, Hannah's body remembering indeed what to do. With Hank supporting her back and the midwife's experienced hands guiding the way, Hannah brought their child into the world with a final, powerful push. A boy. The midwife announced as lusty cries filled the room. A fine, healthy boy. Hannah collapsed back against the pillows, exhaustion and exhilaration warring within her as the midwife placed the squalling infant on her chest. Through tears, she examined her son, the shock of dark hair, the tiny perfect fingers, the determined set of his mouth as he cried his displeasure at this new, bright world. "He's beautiful," Hank whispered, his voice breaking as he gently touched his son's head. "Hannah, he's perfect." "Samuel," Hannah said softly, the name they had chosen if the baby was a boy. Samuel Hank Jameson. Later, when Hannah had been cleaned up and was resting comfortably, Hank brought Lily in to meet her brother. The toddler approached the bed with unusual caution, her eyes wide as she peered at the bundle in Hannah's arms. "Baby," she said, pointing at her brother with a solemn expression. "Yes, Lily," Hannah confirmed. "This is your baby brother, Samuel. Can you say Samuel?" "Sam," Lily pronounced carefully, reaching out to touch his tiny hand. "That's right," Hank said, pride evident in his voice as he watched his children's first interaction. "You're a big sister now, Lily. You'll help us take care of Sam, won't you?" Lily nodded enthusiastically, though Hannah suspected she didn't fully understand the concept. What mattered was that Lily accepted this new presence in their family without jealousy or concern, a blessing Hannah hadn't dared hope for. As the days passed, Samuel proved to be an easy baby, nursing well, sleeping for reasonable stretches, and generally content to be held by either parent. His resemblance to Hank was striking, from his dark hair to the shape of his mouth, though Hannah thought she could see her own mother's eyes in his still changing features. The arrival of their son deepened the connection between Hannah and Hank in ways Hannah hadn't anticipated. Watching him with Samuel, the tender care he took in handling such a tiny being, the songs he sang during night feedings, the pride that shone in his eyes with each small milestone, Hannah fell in love with her husband all over again. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel sleeping peacefully in Hannah's arms while Lily played with her wooden animals nearby, Hank broached a subject they had discussed but not yet decided. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "about James and Nathan." Hannah tensed slightly but nodded for him to continue. "We've never visited their graves together," Hank said, "and I was wondering if perhaps it might be time, if you might want to take Samuel and Lily there." It was a sensitive suggestion, one that acknowledged the place Hannah's first family still held in her heart. In the whirlwind of change that had followed Hank and Lily's arrival in her life, Hannah had maintained her private ritual of visiting the graves on significant dates, but she had never shared this aspect of her grief with her new family. "I'd like that," she said after a moment's reflection. "They're part of who I am, part of what made me the woman you and the children love. It feels right to introduce you all properly." The next day, as the afternoon light slanted golden through the aspen grove behind the cabin, Hannah led her family to the small fenced plot where two simple wooden markers stood side by side. She had maintained the area meticulously over the years, planting wildflowers that bloomed from spring through fall, keeping the grass neatly trimmed. Lily, sensing the solemnity of the occasion, clung to Hank's hand, unusually quiet. Samuel, wrapped securely against Hannah's chest, slept on, unaware of the emotional significance of this first family pilgrimage. Nathan and James Morgan, Hank read from the markers, his voice respectful. "Beloved husband and son." "Nathan was a good man," Hannah said, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. Kind, hard-working, patient. He taught me so much about building, about working with wood. She smiled faintly. He'd have liked you, Hank. You share that same quiet strength. She knelt carefully, mindful of Samuel against her chest, and touched the smaller marker. And James. He was just 3 when the influenza took him. So bright, so curious about everything. He would have been 11 now. She glanced at Lily, who was watching her with solemn eyes. He would have been a wonderful big brother. Hank knelt beside her, one arm around her shoulders while his other hand still held Lily's. "Thank you for sharing them with us," he said simply. They remained there for a time, Hannah sharing a few stories about Nathan and James, answering Lily's hesitant questions with age-appropriate honesty. It wasn't the somber, grief-stricken visit of previous years, but something new, a recognition of loss that didn't diminish the joy of the present. As they walked back to the cabin together, Lily skipping ahead to chase a butterfly, Samuel beginning to stir against Hannah's chest, Hank squeezed Hannah's hand. "You're the bravest person I know," he said quietly. Hannah looked at him in surprise. "Me? How do you figure that?" To have endured such loss, to have lived with that grief alone for so many years, and still be able to open your heart again, that takes incredible courage. Hannah considered his words as they walked. "I don't know if it was courage so much as necessity," she replied finally. "That night when you and Lily appeared on my doorstep in the storm. You weren't the only one seeking shelter. I think perhaps I needed saving just as much as you did." Hank smiled, the expression lighting his blue eyes in a way that still made Hannah's heart skip. "Then I'm grateful we found each other, Hannah Morgan Jameson. More grateful than I can say." As they reached the cabin, their home, filled now with the sounds and presence of children, of life continuing despite loss, Hannah felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for so long. The past remained, honored and remembered, but no longer casting shadows over her present or future. When she had lived alone on this homestead, Hannah had believed she was protecting herself from further pain. What she hadn't understood was that in isolating herself from the possibility of loss, she had also cut herself off from the joy of connection with community, with family, with love. Standing now in the yard she had maintained alone for 8 years, surrounded by the family she had never expected to have again, Hannah sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever fate or providence had brought a cowboy and his motherless baby to her door on that stormy night. Some might call it chance, others divine intervention. Hannah preferred to think of it as a second chance, one she had almost turned away but had found the courage to embrace. And in that embrace, she had found not just survival, but a life more abundant than she had ever dared to hope for.